Jessica Miller sat at the small kitchen table, staring into the refrigerator with a mix of resignation and determination. The hum of the old appliance was loud in the silence of the house. Inside, the shelves were nearly bare, a half loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter scraped down to the sides, and 2 eggs. It wasn't the first time the fridge looked this way. As a single mother raising 2 kids on a modest paycheck, Jessica had become an expert at stretching groceries, clipping coupons, and making do. Still, the end of the month was always the hardest, and this time felt even heavier. She had just enough food for one more dinner, and payday was 3 days away. Her children, Lily, 8, and Max, 5, were asleep in the bedroom they shared. Their giggles and chatter had filled the house earlier, but now the silence reminded her of all the nights she quietly worried about how she'd make things work. She wanted more for them, more than peanut butter sandwiches, more than secondhand clothes, more than a mom who sometimes skipped meals so they wouldn't have to. That night, she made the sandwiches anyway, spreading the peanut butter thin, carefully dividing the bread so her children would have enough in the morning. She fried 1 egg, the last one, and set it on her plate. She wasn't really hungry anymore, but it felt wrong to leave the plate empty. Jessica had just lifted her fork when a sharp knock rattled her front door. She froze. It was almost midnight. Nobody ever knocked this late, especially in her quiet neighborhood. She pushed back from the table, heart pounding, and peered out the window. Parked at the curb was a police cruiser, headlights cutting through the dark. Standing on her porch was a tall man in uniform. For a moment she thought of ignoring it, pretending she wasn't home. But something in her heart told her otherwise. She unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to speak. "Ma'am," the officer said politely, tipping his head. His voice was weary but kind. "Sorry to bother you this late. My partner and I have been on patrol all day. We were about to grab dinner, but the diner closed early. I noticed your light was still on and, well, I wondered if you might have a cup of coffee or something warm." Jessica hesitated. She didn't have much. In fact, she had almost nothing. But when she looked at his tired face, she saw more than just a uniform. She saw exhaustion, maybe even loneliness. Something about him reminded her of her brother who had served overseas, men who carried their burdens quietly. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. In the kitchen, she set her plate with the egg in front of him. He immediately shook his head. "I can't take your food. You need this." Jessica gave a small smile. "It's fine. You need it more than I do tonight." Reluctantly, he sat and began to eat. They introduced themselves. His name was Officer Daniel Carter. He told her he'd been working back-to-back shifts, and his wife was expecting their first child. Nervous about fatherhood, he admitted he often wondered if he'd be good enough. Jessica found herself talking too, sharing bits of her own life, the kids, the juggling of bills, the way she sometimes felt invisible. For nearly an hour, they spoke like old friends, 2 strangers who understood struggle in different ways. When he finally stood to leave, Daniel paused at the door. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Most people wouldn't have opened their door to me tonight. But you did. Thank you." Jessica shrugged lightly. "Most people don't know what it feels like to go without." He gave her a long look, as though memorizing her face, then tipped his hat and left. Jessica washed the empty plate, her stomach hollow, and went to bed. She had no idea. Her small act of kindness had set something much bigger in motion. The next morning, Jessica was woken by the sound of engines rumbling outside, louder than garbage trucks, heavier than the usual morning traffic. At first, she thought it was construction. But then came the thud of boots on pavement, the distant shout of commands, and the low chop of helicopters overhead. Her heart raced. She ran to the window. What she saw nearly made her knees buckle. Her quiet street was swarming with people, agents in dark jackets marked FBI, tactical teams with rifles, armored vehicles parked bumper to bumper. Black SUVs and vans filled the road as far as she could see. There had to be over 100 agents, maybe more. She thought she was dreaming until someone pounded on her front door. With trembling hands, she opened it, and found herself staring at Daniel Carter. But he wasn't wearing his patrol uniform this time. He wore a suit, a badge clipped to his belt. Behind him, agents scanned the street with radios, their movements quick and purposeful. "Ms. Miller," Daniel said, his voice calm but urgent. "Don't be afraid. You and your children are safe. I owe you an explanation." Jessica's mouth opened, but no words came. Daniel stepped inside, lowering his tone. I wasn't just on patrol last night. I work with a joint FBI task force. For months, we've been tracking a dangerous group operating right here in this neighborhood, arms trafficking, money laundering, you name it. We've had eyes on this street for weeks. Jessica's eyes widened. Here, on this street, 3 houses down, he confirmed. We've been waiting for the right moment. That's why there are so many agents today, we're bringing them all in at once. As if on cue, shouts rang out down the block. Tactical teams swarmed a house, battering the door open. Helicopters thundered overhead, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, stunned at the invasion of federal agents on their sleepy street. Jessica gripped the doorframe. My kids, they're safe, Daniel reassured her quickly. Agents will escort them to school today. You don't have to worry. Her mind spun. The world outside looked like a war zone, yet here stood the same man she'd fed her last meal to just hours earlier. None of it felt real. Daniel reached into his jacket and set an envelope on her kitchen counter. This isn't charity, he said firmly. It's gratitude. Last night, you gave me your last meal without hesitation. You reminded me why I do this job, why it matters. Inside is enough to help you and your kids get back on your feet. Consider it a new beginning. Jessica stared at the envelope, her throat tight. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Daniel replied. Just keep going. Keep being the kind of person who makes the world better in small ways. Sometimes those small things are bigger than you think. By afternoon, news crews had descended on the street, broadcasting one of the largest FBI operations in the state. Viewers across the country watched as agents hauled boxes of evidence, weapons, and suspects from the raided house. But inside her modest home, Jessica sat quietly with her children, watching from the safety of their living room. She knew life wouldn't magically become easy. Bills would still come, groceries would still stretch thin. But something inside her had shifted. Her small act of kindness, the decision to open the door, to share her last meal, had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined. It had touched the life of a man who carried enormous responsibility, and in return, it had brought a sliver of hope back into hers. That night, after the agents had gone and the news vans had rolled away, Jessica tucked Lily and Max into bed. She kissed their foreheads and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. For the first time, she believed that better days were ahead. And all of it had begun with a simple act, a single mom sharing her last meal with a stranger. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence of Jessica Miller's tiny kitchen. She stared at the shelves. 2 eggs, half a loaf of bread, and the last of a jar of peanut butter. Payday was still 3 days away. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this problem. As a single mother raising 2 kids on a modest paycheck from her receptionist job, Jessica had become skilled at making ends meet, stretching meals, clipping coupons, and praying her children never realized how tight things really were. That night, she made peanut butter sandwiches for her kids, Lily, 8, and Max, 5. She smiled and laughed with them at the table, making silly faces as if dinner were a grand feast instead of what it really was, survival. After tucking them into bed, she returned to the kitchen. With the last egg, she fried herself a small dinner. She sat at the table, fork in hand, ready to eat. Then came the knock. It was sharp, sudden, and startling at nearly midnight. Jessica froze. She crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. A police cruiser idled at the curb, headlights glowing. A tall officer stood at her porch, waiting. Her first instinct was to stay quiet, but something in her heart told her to open the door. "Ma'am," the officer said politely when she cracked it open. His voice was steady but tired. "Sorry to bother you this late. My partner and I have been on patrol all day. We were headed for dinner, but the diner closed early. I noticed your light was still on and wondered, could I trouble you for a cup of coffee or something warm?" Jessica hesitated. She had almost nothing left. But when she looked at his face, exhausted, maybe even lonely, she saw a man not so different from her brother who had served overseas. Someone carrying the weight of the world. "Come in," she said softly. Inside, she slid her plate across the table, the one with her last egg. The officer shook his head. "I can't take your food. You need this more than I do." Jessica smiled faintly. "It's fine, please. You look like you need it more than me." Reluctantly, he sat. As he ate, they talked. His name was Officer Daniel Carter. He admitted he'd been working double shifts. His wife was expecting their first child, and he confessed he was nervous about fatherhood. Jessica, in turn, shared bits of her life, her kids, her struggles, the way she sometimes felt invisible. For nearly an hour, two strangers sat in a small kitchen, confiding in each other. It was the kind of conversation that stitched a quiet thread of trust between them. When he finally rose to leave, Daniel paused at the door. "Most people wouldn't have opened the door tonight. But you did. Thank you. You don't know what this means to me." Jessica shrugged. "Most people don't know what it feels like to go without." He gave her a long, thoughtful look, then tipped his hat and left. Jessica washed the empty plate, her stomach still empty, and went to bed. She had no idea that this small act of kindness would change her life by morning. Part 2. The morning after. Jessica woke to the roar of engines outside her window. At first she thought it was construction, but then came the heavy stomp of boots, the crackle of radios, the unmistakable whir of helicopters overhead. She bolted to the window, and nearly fainted. Her quiet street was flooded with black SUVs, armored vans, and agents in dark jackets marked FBI. Dozens, no, more than 100, poured across the neighborhood, surrounding houses, shouting commands. The street looked like the set of a crime drama. Her heart pounded. What was happening? Then came the pounding on her own door. Jessica opened it a crack, only to find herself face to face with Daniel Carter. But this time, he wasn't wearing his police uniform. He wore a dark suit, a badge clipped to his belt. Behind him, federal agents swept the street with rifles and radios. "Ms. Miller," Daniel said calmly, "don't be afraid. You and your children are safe. I owe you an explanation." Jessica stared at him, speechless. Daniel stepped inside. "I wasn't just a patrol officer last night. I'm also part of a joint FBI task force. We've been tracking a criminal group for months, arms trafficking, money laundering, the works. And they've been operating right here. 3 houses down." Jessica's mouth fell open. "Here, on this street." He nodded. "We've been watching them for weeks. Today was the day we moved in. That's why there are so many agents here." As if on cue, a thunderous crash echoed down the block. Tactical teams battered open a door, shouting as they swarmed a house. Helicopters thundered above. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, stunned at the invasion. Jessica clutched the doorframe. "My kids. They're safe," Daniel reassured quickly. "Agents will escort them to school today. Nothing will happen to them." Her mind whirled. Just last night, she'd given him her last egg. Now here he was, standing in her kitchen, while her street filled with 150 FBI agents. It felt impossible, like a dream she hadn't woken from. Then Daniel reached into his jacket. He set an envelope on the counter. "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "It's gratitude. Last night, you gave me your last meal without hesitation. You reminded me why this work matters, why I do what I do. Inside is enough to get you and your kids back on your feet. Think of it as a new beginning." Jessica's eyes blurred with tears. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," he replied. "Just promise me you'll keep going. Keep being the kind of person who makes the world better, even in small ways. Sometimes those small things matter more than we realize." By afternoon, news crews had descended on the neighborhood, reporting on one of the largest FBI operations in the state. Across the country, people watched as agents hauled boxes of evidence, weapons, and suspects from the raided house. Inside her modest home, Jessica sat quietly with Lily and Max, holding them close as they watched the coverage. She knew bills would still come. She knew groceries would still stretch thin. But something had changed inside her. Her kindness, an act as simple as sharing a last meal, had rippled farther than she ever imagined. It had touched the life of a man with enormous responsibility. And in return, it had brought hope, security, and a new beginning for her little family. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, Jessica whispered a prayer of thanks. For the first time in a long time, she believed better days were coming. And all of it had begun with a single choice, opening her door to a stranger, and offering him the very last meal she had.